It's over. Russia has won. Whether the West wants to admit it or not, the facts are clear. Russia has achieved its strategic objectives, and Vladimir Putin alone will dictate the terms of peace. But how did we get here? And more importantly, who's really responsible for this war? The truth is, this war didn't start in 2022 under Biden. It started in 2014, and some would argue it began even earlier in 2004 with the Orange Revolution, an event deeply tied to the lingering tensions of the Cold War arms race between the US and Russia. This culminated in the Maidan Color Revolution, a coup orchestrated by the CIA and George Soros. Ukraine, once neutral, was transformed into a Western puppet state.
I set up a foundation in Ukraine before Ukraine became independent of Russia. And the foundation has been functioning ever since.
Its government handed over to the ultra-nationalists like the infamous Azov Battalion, who openly identify as neo-Nazis. These extremists began a brutal shelling campaign against the ethnically Russian regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, areas that had voted to secede from Ukraine. The United Nations condemned these atrocities, but the West turned a blind eye. And so, after nearly a decade of violence, Russia has no choice but to intervene. And what has Ukraine done with the blank checks they've been handed? Corruption is rampant. Over $400 billion in foreign aid has flowed into Ukraine, $300 billion from the US alone, yet even Zelensky himself admitted that only $100 billion has actually reached Ukraine.
Коли говорять, що Україна під час війни отримала 200 мільярдів на підтримку армії, тощо, це неправда. Я не знаю, де всі ці гроші.
So where did the rest go? Laundered through the military-industrial complex, funneled through NGOs, and pocketed by oligarchs, all while Ukrainian soldiers and civilians suffer. Let's talk about Zelensky's rule. His government has banned opposition parties and shut down media outlets critical of his regime. Press freedom, gone. Elections postponed indefinitely under the guise of martial law. Even worse, his forces roam the streets, dragging men from their homes and public places, forcing them into a hopeless meat grinder. Then there's the case of Coach Red Pill, also known as Gonzalo Lira, a Chilean-American journalist living in Ukraine. Lira dared to speak out against Zelensky's corrupt regime. He was arrested by Ukrainian secret police.
So either I will cross the border into Hungary in the next couple of hours, or I will be arrested again, and God knows what will happen to me.
And let's not forget, this war could have ended long ago. Diplomatic solutions were on the table, but Zelensky refused. Instead, he pushed for escalations that led to thousands of needless deaths, all to keep the Western war machine running. The Biden administration and NATO aren't interested in peace. They want to use Ukraine as a pawn to weaken Russia and to seize its resources. But it failed. Russia stood firm, and now it is Russia that holds all the cards. Thwarted diplomatic opportunities. Early in the conflict, potential diplomatic solutions were not fully explored, which might have prevented escalation. There was an opportunity for peace in 2022 when rapid Russian advances were early in the war and created a crisis of confidence. This was thwarted by actions of former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who sabotaged the proposed peace talks, telling Zelensky that there would be terrible repercussions for him and Ukraine if any steps were taken toward peace. The government has imposed restrictions on press freedom, with journalists facing intimidation and independent outlets being shut down. The censorship has de facto extended into Western countries whose political elites have sided with Ukraine, using soft power to quash open investigations into their own role in fomenting the crisis. A prime example is the destruction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, an act initially blamed on Russia. But Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh exposed the truth, uncovering the real sequence of events that led to its destruction. And how did mainstream media respond? They ignored it. The story was buried, related to the Substack post, while Western governments ensured the public never saw the full picture.
I am, and I think the administration is very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea.
Trump and Vance need to be aware of how dangerous the situation is becoming. The UK and EU are now taking on the mantle of responsibility for Ukraine and are indicating their desire to deploy peacekeepers. The real reason why they are doing this is to provoke Putin into punitive action against a NATO target. The most likely scenario involves an attack on UK Typhoon fighters stationed in Poland. Such an attack would be used as a justification for triggering Article 5, which would commit the US to intervene.
A cornerstone of the alliance states that an armed attack against one member is considered an attack against all, obligating other members to assist the attacked nation, including with armed force, if necessary.
The UK and EU regimes want an American backstop, basically a situation in which Americans can be manipulated via a manufactured crisis into conflict with Russia. The US needs to be prepared to threaten withdrawal from NATO. I repeat, the US needs to be prepared to threaten withdrawal from NATO, as in the event of Article 5 triggering. Nothing less will ensure peace. If Trump fails and allows himself to be gulled into conflict with Russia, he will go down in history as having overseen one of the bloodiest and most horrific epochs in world history. It will be like 1,000 Vietnams. Trump cannot allow his presidency to be defined by the epic failure that was Biden's Ukraine folly. So ask yourself, who's really the villain in this war? The man who defended his people for years of Western-backed terror? Or the puppet president who sold his country for foreign cash and power? History will remember the truth. The only question is, will you see it too before it's too late?